It is 7:05 p.m. East African time. Welcome to the Black Hot Fire News Update. At 7 with me, Dimori, and we are going to be looking at everything that has been happening throughout the whole of Africa today on the 16th of April 2024. It's a beautiful evening in Nairobi, a cold one. It has been raining for the whole of the day, as has been the case in almost each and every East African country, with floods being reported in some parts of Kenya and some floods being reported in Tanzania that killed 58 people yesterday, and landslides getting reported, of course, in Rwanda. So it is rainy and a good time to harvest water for the countries, especially East African countries. Anyway, welcome to the Black Hot Fire News Update. We're going to be looking at everything that has been hitting the headlines today, starting with Nigeria, where Nigeria's economic woes look like they are deepening even more, with the country experiencing its highest inflation in 28 years. I'm going to be telling you what is happening in Nigeria and why its economic woes seem to be deepening each and every day instead of things getting better. Things in Nigeria are just but getting worse. We're also going to be looking at how Macron has pledged 2.1 billion US dollars to aid war in Sudan, and what is Macron's interest in Sudan and the war. We're going to be looking at Kenya, where Kenya is proposing a treaty to end the Somalia-Ethiopia tension. There has been an ongoing tension in Ethiopia and Somalia over, I'm going to be telling you what has been happening over an area called Somaliland. There's a breakaway region called Somaliland, and it looks like Ethiopia might be losing Somaliland, and that is bringing about a lot of tension. And that is why Kenya is coming up with a treaty. Of course, with Kenya feeling like it's the giant, the regional giant, so it's taking upon itself to come up with a treaty to help and ease the situation in Somalia and Ethiopia. I'm going to be telling you about how Egypt is set to receive. I was to tell you this yesterday, but time did not allow. So I'll be telling you about how Egypt is set to receive 1 billion loan from the EU, in addition to the 8 billion loan that they got from the IMF. I'll be telling you why. We're also going to be looking at Zimbabwe and its new currency, the ZiG, and how Zimbabweans are being forced to use the US dollar in absence of the new currency, the ZiG. So the ZiG was launched, but it is not there. And now people have resorted to going back to using the dollar because of the inavailability of the ZiG. I'm also going to be telling you about a report that the World Bank released that shows how least developed countries are getting poorer as gap between the poor and the rich country continues to widen. So this was a report by the World Bank that is showing that 75 most vulnerable countries are facing a widening income gap with the wealthiest economy for the first time in this century. So the gap is getting bigger. That is according to the World Bank. We're going to be looking at that. And we're going to be looking at corpses that were found adrift in a boat off Brazil that are most likely migrants from Mauritania and Mali. So these are African migrants who had tried to go to Brazil, and they died in a boat accident. So corpses were found in a boat off Brazilian coast, with migrants who are feared to have been from Mauritania and Mali. We're also going to be looking at Senegal, which is set to host the first Olympic event in Africa. That is in 2026, where Africa is anticipating the first ever Youth Olympic Games to be hosted in the continent. So the event is going to happen in Dakar, the capital of Senegal. I'm going to be telling you about that, and how the same country, Senegal, seized nearly 1,000 kgs of cocaine. I was talking about drugs and the drug problem in Africa, and today Senegal seized 1,000 kgs of cocaine. And lastly, we are going to be looking deeply and much deeply on the economic woes that are happening in Nigeria. And I'm going to be telling you what has been happening in Nigeria and why Nigeria is experiencing its highest inflation in 28 years. So let me give you a little bit of context before we get there. So it is 2022, October, and the Central Bank of Nigeria announced a move that it has decided to redesign the country's highest denomination, that is the Nigerian naira, 200 and 500 Nigerian naira, and the 1,000 Nigerian naira. So it said it would be removing all old notes from circulation, and people were given a deadline of January 31st, 2023 to make this exchange. So the announcement was made on October 26th, and they were given until January 31st to have returned all the old notes. The reason for this, according to the government, was one, so a little more context. January 31st was the deadline of returning the old notes, and it was a couple of weeks before the national election, the Nigerian national election. So the main aim for this, according to the government, was to curb counterfeiting, encourage cashless transaction, and limit the buying of votes during the elections. So Tinubu was feeling like votes would be bought, and he therefore changed the denominations to limit the buying of votes during the elections. But this, of course, proved disastrous. One, the time span that people were given to return the old notes was not enough. It was only from October 26th to January 31st. That is just like hardly 2 months for you to have returned all the notes, because the government said by January 31st, all the old notes would cease to be a valid legal tender. So I'm just giving you a little bit of context on why Nigeria is going through the economic woes it's going through right now. And if we are to look at one of the reasons, we have to go back to October 26, 2022, the Central Bank of Nigeria announcing a change in the country's denomination notes. So one, as I said, the time span was not enough for people to return. The deadline was too short, and there was limited availability of new notes and inadequate communication because people did not know what was happening. It was an abrupt decision by the government saying, if you have old notes, return them by this date or they're not going to be valid. So this created panics, led to long queues in banks, frustration amongst citizens, and a thriving black market for new notes. Of course, it is Nigeria. So people are sold fake new notes. People exchange their legit new notes with fake ones. So for once, people lost a lot of money in this. And the confusion surrounding the currency redesign led to people losing, especially the rich. And it is the rich that push the economy. It is the extremely high class, the very rich, that in most cases push the economy, not the really the ones who make the biggest transactions and everything. So they lost confidence in the naira because nobody knew where it was going. Nobody knew what the new currency, which the new currency was legit. The black market was thriving. People were getting scammed of the old currency. The banks were full of long queues. The deadline was approaching. And so people began to look for other mediums as a store of value because, as you know, money is a store of value. If I have $100, then that is conventionally me saying this piece of paper is worth $100 in exchange value. It's in exchange value. So people started looking for other mediums as a store of value and as a medium of exchange. And of course, the obvious choices were the foreign currencies like the US dollar and the British pound, as well as cryptocurrencies like the Tether USDT. So what that meant was the demand for Nigerian naira notes went down, and a lot of money was also lost because not everybody was able to take back the old notes by January 31st, and that meant that some people were left with the money, but it was not a valid legal tender, so it was worthless. So many people in Nigeria were left with worthless pieces of paper because the deadline, as I said, was short, the communication was not enough, and that is how the confidence issues with the naira began. So Bola Tinubu won again, and once he won, of course, the first thing that he did was try to reshape the economy, which he had messed with the previous regime had messed. So in his inaugural address in May 2023, Tinubu announced further economic reforms that would see Nigeria go even deeper downwards. One is that he did away with the fuel subsidy, referring to the government's long-standing fuel subsidies as archaic. So over the coming days, he would announce the reversal of the currency redesign policy, and the next thing that he did was floating the Nigerian naira on the foreign exchange market. Floating the Nigerian naira on the foreign exchange market at a time when the Nigerian naira was in low demand because of low confidence, especially for large investors. You know, the normal Nigerian citizen, lower class, does not have that choice of going for the US dollar, of going for the pound. You can only transact with the naira. But for the big corporations, once they see the currency is not working, once they don't have the confidence in currency, they are going to look for another store of value, of course. So he floated the currency at a time when the currency was having confidence issues. And even if the currency is not having confidence issues, even if the currency is doing well, once you float the currency, especially in a country that is dependent on importations and that does not export anything, once you start doing that, of course, one thing that is going to happen is the currency is going to lose value and lose it in a big margin. And that is what happened to the Nigerian naira. It lost value and lost it heavily. The fuel subsidies getting done with meant that the cost of fuel went up. And as you know, the fuel is the backbone of most African economies. It's the backbone of most economies, to be specific, because one, it's used in production of power. Power drives industries. Industries produce commodities that people consume. So once the price of fuel goes up, then the production cost of most commodities goes up, and that means uh, tougher living conditions for the people. And of course, that is what happened. The fuel went up, transportation cost went up, everything skyrocketed. People could no longer be able to afford basic commodities, and the Nigerian naira went. The value of the Nigerian naira plummeted down, and once that happened, Nigeria, being a country that is heavily reliant on imports, meant that anything that was imported to Nigeria was now coming at a higher price, and that is one of the reasons why Nigeria is going through one of its toughest economic periods. It in fact reported its highest inflation rate in March for the last 28 years, its highest inflation for the past 28 years. The other issues that are fueling the flames of Nigeria's tough economic conditions, such as when Tinubu took power, the country had a large amount of foreign debt, of course, as is with many African countries. And once the foreign debt is high, and the foreign reserves the foreign reserves are small, and the debt is high, then that means even the little that Nigeria accumulated, even the little that Nigeria was able to collect, that Nigeria is able to collect right now, goes back towards the repayment of debt. So that is like adding salt to the wound, because the country is already going through it, and now it still has a large amount of foreign debt to deal with. In fact, petrol in Nigeria, they use something called premium motor spirit, which you might know as gasoline in the West. It used to retain at about 0.12 US dollars per liter. It increased by 196% overnight. 196% overnight. That is after Tinubu did away with the subsidies, and the Nigerian naira went down in value. So, and as I said, challenges with developing economies like Nigeria, like Kenya, and like most African countries is that a rise in fuel price tends to 100% cause the price of everything else to rise up. Industries such as manufacturing, agriculture, all of them rely heavily on fuel for powering machineries and equipment, and also for supplying the commodities once produced, that is in the chain of supply. The other thing is Nigeria is heavily dependent on fuel for power. Nigeria does not have enough power supply. Most Nigerians use generators to power their homes. So the Nigerian government led by Tinubu said that it was doing away the fuel subsidies, and that the money that would be saved from the subsidies would be redistributed to improve things like education, healthcare, and the general welfare of the people. Because it cost about 400 billion Nigerian naira a month for the fuel subsidies. But the 400 billion a month was saved because the subsidies were not paid. But the same has not been seen reinvested in improved education, in healthcare, in provision of general welfare, like people had said. And that led to the currency, that coupled with the currency devaluation, and Nigeria heavily depending on imported commodities from essential goods, like food, fuel, medicine. So once a currency devaluates, of course, the people of Nigeria are going to suffer and they're going to have it roughly. So what did the Central Bank of Nigeria do to shield the people from this? It didn't do anything. In fact, it made things worse. So the Central Bank of Nigeria implemented measures to counter the crisis. One of them was raising the interest rates from 18.75 to 22.75. Raising the interest rates, that is, the central bank is the one that is responsible for the interest rates in all the other banks, as you know. So because it is the one that is in charge of regulating the other banks. So raising the interest rates, of course, meant that access to credit in Nigeria became tougher and people could no longer be able to access credit. If I wanted to start a business in Nigeria, it was tougher for me to go to a bank and get a loan. And most businesses operate on the credit side. Especially most big businesses operate on the credit side. Most big legit businesses, they operate on the credit side. So that meant access to credit was reduced, and of course, it started even selling US dollars through auctions. So this looked like it worked a little bit once they increased the interest rates, because that would see the central bank and the banks collect more money from people who had loans, and that would mean more money for the government to spend in repaying the debts, more money for the government to spend in whatever. And that is why the naira has appreciated by 6.89%. It appreciated by 6.89% a day after the interest rates were raised. However, this has not solved anything because the inflation is still skyrocketing, the highest in 28 years. The foreign debts are still there to be paid. The currency has started improving. You have to give it to them for that. It appreciated by 6.89%. But the cost of living is yet to change, and the people of Nigeria still cannot access capital, credit to start businesses and finance themselves. And of course, everything is at the highest to a point that Nigerians are now depending on food from the government. And that is what has been happening in Nigeria, and that is why Nigeria's economic woes are continuing to worsen. The blame for this would be uninformed economic reforms, making reforms without considering the repercussions of it. The second would be the huge public debt that Nigeria has, that is, of course, affecting their disposable. A country also has disposable income. Once it has dealt with the recurrent expenditure, that is the money used to pay the day-to-day running of the government, the day-to-day salary, the administration cost. Once it has sorted all that, there is the money that is left for development. So that is what I would equate to disposable income. So Nigeria's disposable income, Nigeria's money that is left for development in Nigeria is minimal, negligible. Couple that with corruption, couple that with the fact that Nigeria is going through insecurity. It is having an insecurity crisis with kidnappings happening every day, and of course Boko Haram threatening people in the northern part of Nigeria. And you'll understand why Nigerians are in the streets, because they are in the streets. They are protesting the high cost of living. They have been protesting the high cost of living for the past couple of weeks, carrying placards written "Stop the looting." So Nigerians, the normal Nigerian citizen who is not informed of all these things, who doesn't know what is happening with the World Bank, what is happening with the floating of the currency, who doesn't understand all that, is suffering. And that is why they were saying they feel like the government is just taxing the poor and not taxing the rich, which might be true because the rich are never taxed. They find evasive measures to evade the taxes. The corporations, the big corporations, always find means and measures and strategies to evade taxes. So it's the common Nigerian who's end up suffering from, of course, the interest rates. And at the end of the day, the economy is gonna look like it's doing better, but it's not doing better because the burden has been transferred to the lower side of the economic field. Instead of it being transferred upwards to help who are doing better, it has been transferred downwards, down the economic pyramid. So that is Nigeria with its economic woes, with it seeing a record inflation in March, where inflation rose to 1.5%, from 1.5% to 33.20%. This is the highest in 28 years. So let us look at other news from other parts of Africa. And one of them is in Zimbabwe, where Zimbabweans launched a new currency. It's called the ZiG. However, Zimbabweans have been forced to use the US dollar because apparently the new currency that they launched, the ZiG, is not there in the market. You want to use the ZiG. Of course, as I said, the currency is a store of value, a medium of exchange. So you want to buy something and you cannot find the ZiG. So that has caused citizens to end up going back to the US dollar because there isn't enough ZiG in the market. The other reason is Zimbabweans informal traders, who account for about 75% of all employment in the nation, have stopped accepting the ZiG, fearing its value has declined. It's a new currency. It was supposed to be effective from April 8th, but was delayed until April 30th, leaving the US dollar dominating the market. So the informal traders are having fears. They are not sure if the ZiG is gonna work. They're not sure of the real value of the ZiG. They haven't been given enough information on the functioning, on the structures, on how the ZiG is supposed to work, on what backs, on the real value of the ZiG currency. Therefore, they are not they are rejecting, they're not accepting the ZiG, even though it's going to officially become effective from April 30th. So as of now, even with the ZiG, the US dollar is dominating the market. And all Zimbabwe is hoping is that the new currency that they have introduced will bring stability and lower inflation. But one thing with a currency is for it to be acceptable, is for it to be a measure of value, is for it to be a medium of transfer. It has to be acceptable. That is, in fact, one of the major characteristics of a currency. A currency cannot be a currency if it's not acceptable. The buyer and the seller have to agree that this is the real value of this note that you're giving me. I'm selling this product at $100, at 100 Kenya shillings, at 100 Tanzanian shillings, at 100 naira, and this is a representative of that value. So the problem that Zimbabwe is having is people are not yet fully aware, fully conversant. People are not yet a value of the ZiG, and now, of course, it is having confidence issues, especially with informal traders who are not as educated as the big corporations, and they constitute about 75% of Zimbabwe's daily exchange. So once they do not accept, the ZiG is going to fall. So I don't know what the government of Zimbabwe can do to help deal with this, the issue of the ZiG, some traders not accepting the ZiG, citing that they are not sure of the real value, and they are fearing that its value might decline in the future. What if it fails? What if 3 weeks into the run the zig fails and I have a million zigs in my pocket? Where do I take my money? So at some point you understand the fears of these informal investors. All they care about is a currency that will be worth the same amount so that I can go back to the market and buy products worth the same amount. So their fears are legitimate because looks like the Zimbabwean government is not giving them enough assurance on the real value, on the real assurance that the value is not going to decline with time. That is what is happening in Zimbabwe. And the World Bank released a statement yesterday. It released a report, actually, and I was going through the report. And the report summarized is talking about how least developed countries are getting poorer, while rich nations are getting richer. Water is wet. So, on a report that they released yesterday, the World Bank revealed that one half of the world's 75 most vulnerable countries are facing a widening income gap with the wealthiest economies. So, over half of them, that is 39 in all, 39 out of the 75 most vulnerable countries in the world are in sub Saharan Africa. I don't know why they never cited the reason for this, but they cited that 39 out of the 75, 75 of the most vulnerable countries are facing a widening income gap with the wealthiest economies. Instead of the gap becoming smaller, it is getting wider. So the report was titled The Great Reversal: Prospects, Risk and Policies in International Development Association Countries. You can look for it online and read all the propaganda in it. It is titled The Great Reversal: Prospects, Policies in International Development Association Countries. What's happening in the 75 countries, most of it propaganda. And the 75 countries are home to 1.9 billion people. So that is a huge, huge population chunk living in poverty. And the World Bank releasing a statement on the same, not knowing they're the main cause of the same. Anyway, that was the statement. You can go look for the statement online. It is online, and it is a lot of propaganda, but you can judge for yourself. In Brazil, police found corpses adrift aboard, and they are fearing that the migrants might have been from Mauritania and Mali. So, deceased migrants who are feared to have been from Mali and Mauritania are believed to be among the victims on a boat full of corpses. So, the police in Brazil that there might be other nationalities, but the main nationalities are from Mali and Mauritania. Fishermen off Brazil's northern coast, state of Para, found the boat adrift on Saturday in the Atlantic Ocean, and the federal police has recovered 9 dead bodies in total as of now. So they're saying they're still working to identify the bodies and the cause of death, but most of them were in advanced stages of decomposition when they were found. We are yet to know what happened to the Mauritanian people and the Malian people who were found. A of dead Africans was found in Brazil. Um, I don't want to say it was a shipwreck because it's yet to be established. Might have been a shipwreck, might have been murders, might have been. But the fact is, a full boat of deceased migrants from Mali and Mauritania were discovered in a boat full of corpses of Brazil. We're going to follow on that development, and I'm going to tell you what propaganda the Brazilian Federal Police are going to say. And lastly, on some positive news, a bit lighter news, Senegal is going to host the first Olympic event in Africa. Africa is anticipating the first ever Youth Olympic Games to be hosted on the continent in Dakar, that is the capital of Senegal. So it's going to happen between October 31st and October 13th, 2026. And it's going to happen in Dakar, Senegal, at least news that not involve deaths or corruption. So that is all I had on the Black Hot Fire News update today. Thank you for joining me. And a big shout out to Royal Constrictor, who's just joined me as I was finishing my update. Make sure to join me tomorrow on the Black Hot Fire News update from 7 to 7:30 p.m. 30 minutes of looking at what was happening throughout the whole of Africa. And today, this is what was happening throughout Africa. Nigeria's economic woes are continuing. Nigeria seeing a record inflation in March, seeing the highest inflation for the past 28 years, with Zimbabweans being forced to use the US dollar in absence of the new currency, the ZIG, which they launched, with traders citing fears that they fear that the currency might lose value, but they do not know the real value, so they are preferring using the US dollar because the government has not given them enough information on the ZIG, the new ZIG. With the World Bank releasing a statement on how least developed countries are getting poorer as gap with richer nations widen, water is wet, and with corpses being found, a whole boat full of corpses being found in Brazil, with the Brazilian Federal Police saying most of the corpses, most of the dead bodies might have been from Mauritania and Mali. The cause of the deaths is to be established, might be a shipwreck, might be murders. And with Senegal going to host its first Olympic event in Africa in 2026. That is all that was happening in Africa today. I hope you enjoyed the rest of your day if you're watching from abroad, and I hope you have an amazing night if you're watching from Africa and Nairobi. Remember to stay warm with the cold weather, wear a jacket like me so that you don't get fever. Anyway, enjoy the rest of your night. See you tomorrow on to Bonge and later on the news update. It's always a pleasure, ladies and gentlemen.